Hello and welcome to 1271 of the Heidegger series. Some results of the hard work, what we gain. What we lost with the Newtonian paradigm is the ability to have models of something, representations, higher order things, a hierarchy of thinking where some levels are lower and some other ones are higher. That is made impossible in the Newtonian paradigm because there are no different levels. It is just a connection between two assumed or hypothesized sides, which is very far from reality. The second thing we gain is an access, once more, I would say, I think it was prevalent in Western society with abstract thinking. We will also eventually, and as I said in the previous lecture, it is a habit of a lifetime, but we will eventually reconquer intellectual life. There is no space for intellectual life in the Newtonian paradigm. Since there is no history, there can be no knowledge, because knowledge only comes from history, cannot come from structure. Structure is in a now, it's the logocentrism of the now, it is the metaphysics of the present. There is no time in the metaphysics of present. And therefore there is no knowing or understanding. We have to make do for structure and empty concepts. This shows that concept can be full, useful, practical at different levels, and we can go higher and higher because our feet will be in the fertile soil of knowledge itself. I'll continue where I left off in 270, and that was page 267. Make sure I can be seen. Take a note of the time. And there we go. Here, in the pre-scientific and pre-philosophical language, is an account of the relation between the present universe and the early universe. This account accords with what we know about the history of the universe. It suggests why the mutability and the stability of the laws of nature may be a feature of this history. It shows how the same processes that gave rise to the stability may also produce the mutability. The mutability of the laws of nature ceases to contradict their stability and begins to complement it once we place both the stability and the mutability in the context of a historical view. It is only when we treat the stability and the mutability of the laws of nature without regard to the historical character of the universe that they appear to contradict each other. Imagine the present cool-down universe in comparison to the universe in its fiery, formative stage as a living corpse with limited kinetic energy, temperature, and degrees of freedom, with an established structure and with enduring regularities, the laws of nature. Yet there was a time of extreme density and temperature, when the distinction between states of affairs and regularities was unclear. When the present division of nature into well-defined constituents was not yet established, when the phenomena were excited to much higher degrees of freedom than those enjoyed by the living corpse. The unexplained values of the dimensionless constants or parameters of nature may have their origin in the process by which this formative moment gave rise to the ensuing regularities and structures. This rudimentary account, a stylized interpretation of certain central features of the history of the universe, such as contemporary cosmology represents it, distinguishes between relatively brief and formative moments of extreme density, kinetic energy and temperature, and the relatively long periods subsequent to these moments of lesser density, kinetic energy, and temperature, in which a universe is worked out. We have increasing reasons to think that these formative moments of extreme density and temperature resulting in a new universe recur. The idea of their recurrence is, by another name, the idea of a succession of causally connected universes, proposed by contrast to the idea of a plurality of causally unconnected universes. To suppose that they recur is not, however, to assume that they recur with the same results as universes with the same constituents and regularities. The recurrence of formative moments without conservation of the same constituents and regularities is the substance of the conjecture of non-cyclic succession. The quantitative values of density, kinetic energy, and temperature in the formative moments are large, but they are not infinite. Because they are large rather than infinite, they are not singularities in the present conventional technical definition of singularity. And thus, on this account, the world does not begin in an infinite initial singularity. The importance of their being large rather than infinite is that the circumstances of the formative moment need not to interrupt the causal pass-through from one universe to the next, although they may stress it that the quantitative values of density, temperature, and kinetic energy are finite, although large must be a presupposition of the thesis of succession. For the purpose of showing how such a view of universal history may account for the combination of the stability of the laws of nature with their mutability. Think of this view as a combination of two pictures of how nature works. At the fiery formative moments, and then in the long subsequent history of the formed universe. Of course, the contrast between these two phases or moments of nature amounts to a stark simplification of historical reality, in which time never ceases to flow, and one state of affairs always turns into another. Moreover, the characteristics of nature in its extremes forms maybe be reproduced, at least to some extent, with a cool down, law-abiding and well-differentiated universe, for example, in the interior of black holes. First, in the theory and formative moments, the values of density, kinetic energy, and temperature are extreme without, however, becoming infinite. That they are finitely large rather than infinite makes them in principle subject to scientific investigation, however indirect. This finitude will be an important consideration when we consider the translation of these ideas into an agenda of empirical and experimental inquiry. If, for example, the circumstances of the earliest universe were described by the conventional concept of a singularity in which the parameters have infinite values, the experiments conducted with the use of particle accelerators could not even in principle mimic features of those circumstances. If, however, the values are finite rather than infinite, we may in principle be able to simulate aspects of those states of the universe. The consequences are far-reaching for a cosmology and a physics that need not take the established universe as their sole basis for insight into the workings of nature. Second, nature does not assume the form of a sharply differentiated structure the distinctions among the elementary constituents of nature break down. There is no longer, and not yet, an established repertory of natural kinds, of the kinds of things that exists. Third, the contrast between laws of nature and the phenomena that they govern ceases to hold. For one thing, this contrast presupposes the transformation of nature into discriminate structure. For another thing, the circumstance of extreme density and temperature is one in which the transformation of phenomena is simultaneously the introduction of new ways in which nature works. So it doesn't work in the same way forever. Thus forth, in such circumstances, new and massive degrees of freedom may be turned on. If we could witness these conditions, we will be justified in saying to one another, we are not, were it not for the unspeakable disproportion between the scales of human and of cosmic time, you have not seen anything yet. The introduction of the new in these formative periods is not, however, a free for all. It is not the spontaneous generation of uncaused effects. It takes place under the influence of what came before, of prior universes, or of the states of the universe prior to the formative events. Causality exists without laws, which is a way of saying that causal connections have not acquired or have lost the repetitious form over a differentiated range of nature that makes it possible to distinguish phenomena from laws. The influence of the causal antecedents must leave its mark on nature during, and therefore also after, the interlude of fire, restricting the range of materials and of processes with which nature works. even when excited to high degrees of freedom and bereft of a discriminate structure. This causal continuity, shaken but never wholly interrupted, must in principle be subject to empirical investigation. Even if we cannot have direct access to any universe or state of affairs prior to the beginnings of our own universe, we may be able to study its after effect and vestiges. Consider now the cool down universe at some time long after its incandescent origin. First, the values of density, kinetic energy, and temperature are greatly reduced. Such a reduction need not imply a contrast between the infinite and the finite. It may be a contrast between orders of magnitude within the realm of the finite. Second, nature has assumed the form of a differentiated structure. It has elementary constituents. In our universe, these constituents have the content described by particle physics, and at another level of emergent complexity by the periodic table. The kinds of things that are there remains as real as their individual instances. At least they are, until we come to the higher forms of animal life in the course of the evolution of the species. Third, together with the distinctions among natural kinds and elementary constituents of nature, there arises or reappears a distinction between states of affairs and the regularities to which they conform. The workings of nature are normalized in the sense that each type of thing acts in a regular fashion that can be represented in effective laws. That is to say, laws applicable to certain domains, each domain being distinguished by a cast of natural kinds and of their interactions. Such laws in turn support causal explanation, although from a wider and deeper view, we come to understand that causal connections are primitive features of nature. The laws derived from the connections, not the other way around. One such style of law-based causal explanation, which presupposes both the transformation of the world into differentiated structure and the distinction between laws of nature and the states of affairs that they govern, is the style that we call the Newtonian paradigm. Fourth, in concert with its other characteristics, the established cool-down universe is one in which nature displays fewer degrees of freedom in the relation of what happens at any given moment to what may come next. This diminishment in degrees of freedom, however, need not to be linear and irreversible. The expansion of the universe may, at any given time, broaden the range of the adjacent possible, as well as witnessing an increase of degrees of freedom, and whether or how the expansion of the universe may allow for an enlargement of the adjacent possible is a matter for empirical investigation at the front line of contemporary cosmology. This parable about the alternative forms of nature expresses as a duality what must in fact be a more complicated set of transitions and variations in the course of the history of the universe. It conveys in highly simplified and stylized form the conjecture motivating the argument against the second cosmological fallacy set out in chapter 1. The case for the conjecture is that it can be more fully and pervasively reconciled with the picture of the universal history enshrined in the now standard cosmological model than the view that takes the workings of nature in the cool-down universe to be the sole form of natural reality. the resulting conception of alternative ways in which nature may work suggests how the relative stability of the laws of nature may complement rather than contradict their relative mutability. The relative stability of the laws is a feature of the established universe. Their relative mutability is a characteristic of the universe in formation of, more generally, in its extreme moments, the assumption that nature always works as it does in the mature universe that we observe, with its differentiation of types of being, built out of the elementary constituents described by the periodic table and by particle physics, with its seemingly clear-cut distinction between states of affairs and laws of nature, and with its severe restraint on the range of the adjacent possible, is the substance of the second cosmological fallacy. However, the distinction between the two movements to which I have resorted in pre-scientific and pre-philosophical language as a heuristic device is only relative. In the first place, it is only relative because the historical character of the universe implies that the cool-down universe arose from the incandescent universe. The transitions and transformations may be much more rapid at some times than at others, especially in the early life of the universe, but they are never instantaneous, never, just as the very large parameters of quantities at the formative moments are never infinite. There must be many states of nature that are intermediate between the two extreme situations invoked in this unscientific parable. The distinction is also relative because the extreme forms of nature may reappear as local phenomena within the cool-down universe, until they may be once again generalized at a later moment in the universal history. It is relative as well because the appearance of new forms of being does not cease in the established universe. The universe in which the distinction between states of affairs and the laws governing them takes hold, and in which effects seem to follow causes in each domain of reality according to the stable regularities revealed by science. Such is the case of the emergence of life on earth, and then of humanity, and of our consciousness and culture. Part of consciousness, I earlier remarked, is machine-like, that is to say, modular and formulaic. However, another part of consciousness is an anti-machine. In this second aspect of its life, consciousness can recombine structures and functions in a fashion that is prefigured and enable, though left unexplained by the plasticity of the brain. Consciousness exhibits a faculty of recursive infinity, the ability to recombine finite elements of natural language, for example, and infinite numbers of ways. It enjoys the power of negative capability, the capacity always to perceive and to think more than its presuppositions will allow. The aspect of consciousness that displays these attributes is what we call imagination. It is because we possess imagination that we are able, not always, to experience the world or to act within it in according to script. We are able to tear the script up. The proponent of a weak reductionist will say that there is nothing in this subversive and transformative activity that contradicts the laws of nature stated in the supposedly fundamental science of physics. The votary of a strong reductionist will go further and assert that even our most subversive, we act at the behest of all-determining physical force. Both will be making empty gestures. Their claims will have little or no claims or no consequence for our actions, or even for an understanding of them. Nothing follows from the compatibility invoked by the weak reductionist other than the rehearsal of the attempt to make the strange seem natural. The strong reductionist, for his part, announces a program of explanation that no one has ever been able to carry out. What these gestures seek to affirm is that the characteristics of nature in the fiery and formative origins of the universe have no afterlife, leave no trace in the established universe. If, however, the universe may become more fixed in its structure and regularities than it was in its origins, it may also witness the rise to forms of being and of experience, even more open than any that existed earlier in its history. Nothing in the recognition of this fact should encourage us to believe that the universe is on our side, or that it is open and creative, as we are by virtue of possessing imagination. Our experience of openness ends in death. Our imaginations are incarnate in dying bodies. We are powerless to look into the beginning or the end of time, or to rest our understanding of the world on definitive and on incontestable ground. The forces of the law-like universe pose for us in the form of insatiable desire. Nothing in our experience gives support to the feel-good philosophies that fill the history of metaphysics and the abuse the prerogative of speculative thought by trading enlightenment for consolation. The contrast between the original and subsequent universe, in addition to suggesting how the laws of nature can be both mutable and stable, also sheds the light on a source of resistance to acknowledgement of the reality of time. Our conception of science is formed on the model of the relatively cold and consolidated universe. Each of the attributes of nature in this state has a counterpart in the model of science that took hold in physics from the time of Galileo and Newton. In that practice of science, recognition of the reality of time has no sure foothold. One of the achievements of cosmology is to have disturbed this view. Both of nature and of science, through its pursuit of a research agenda founded on the idea that the universe has a history. However, it would be just as misguided to base an approach to nature and practice of science on one of these moments of the universe, or on one of these variations of nature, as it is to base it on the other. The task is to accommodate in our ideas all these moments and variations. A feature of any conception capable of carrying out this task is that it will affirm unreservedly the reality of time. The conundrum of the meta-laws to affirm that the laws of nature may change is to confront a problem that is bound to gain ever greater importance in cosmology, and by the hand of cosmology in all of physics. We call this problem the conundrum of the meta-laws. Consider the problem first in its simplest form as an antinomy, whether it is a true antinomy as I argue the antinomy of cosmogenesis to be, or a false one, as many supposed antinomies are, is not something that we can infer in the manner of Immanuel Kant from an inquiry into the structure of rational understanding. We cannot reach a reliable conclusion without regard to any particular content of our belief or to what we discover or fail to discover about nature. It depends on whether we find in science itself rather than in metaphysics a path toward the overcoming of this unacceptable choice. I think it's a good time as ever to end there. It's not so hard to see that what is being saved here and salvaged is knowledge itself. Knowledge comes from history. By denying time and history, we deny knowledge. Knowledge can only grow in the soil of history. And at the same time, that history, it is what reveals that the whole universe is living, so to speak. It gets infused by time. Time is nothing less than the life source. And for me, interested in Indian philosophy, I realized that up to now, what I've been doing is to be inside the Newtonian paradigm, and inside of that, trying to infuse myself with prana, energy. I think that will never work, because time is prana. And only by dissolving the Newtonian paradigm in knowledge will we gain that force, that immense force, once more. It's knowledge, it's strength, it is salutogenic, it is balancing, it is nurturing, it is all those things that prana, chi, ki is, and much more. It is the creation of reality, because time did this mug. If I deny time, knowledge, not like in ideology, but in my system, I deny the cup. And I also deny my models of the cup, the abstract. We are losing out at both ends simultaneously, and we are pushing us into the cave. I saw this nature video of a hermit crab getting into a hole with his back first. This is what we are doing, taking away the glorious reality that we deserve and can enjoy, replacing it with nothingness, replacing it with empty thinking or blockage and tension. I say thank you very much, and now I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.